The subway platform was almost empty that evening. A cold wind pushed through the tunnel, carrying the faint smell of rain from above. Most people hurried past with their heads down, but one man stayed in the corner near the tiles that never quite got clean. He was blind, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, and his fingers rested gently on an old guitar that had seen better days. He began to play a soft hymn, the kind mothers sing to children when the night feels too heavy. The notes floated slow and tender, wrapping around the few souls still waiting for the train. He sang without asking for anything. No hat on the ground, no sign, just the music and his quiet voice carrying words about grace and going home. People slowed for a second. Some dropped a coin out of habit, then kept walking. But one woman in light blue scruggs stopped completely. She had just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital 2 blocks away. Her name was Emily, and her eyes filled with tears the moment she heard the melody. She knew that song. She knew it the way you know a heartbeat that once belonged to someone you loved. Emily stood there, frozen between two worlds. The singer kept playing, unaware that every note was pulling her back to a room on the 5th floor where a patient named Daniel had spent his last weeks. Daniel was only 42, taken too soon by cancer, but he never complained. Every night, when the pain grew sharp, he would hum that exact hymn until he fell asleep. Emily had sat with him many times, holding his hand while the machines beeped softer and softer. On his final evening, he had opened his eyes one last time and whispered the words Emily now heard, rising from the subway tiles. The blind musician reached the chorus, his voice breaking just slightly on the higher notes. Emily felt her knees grow weak. She stepped closer, careful not to startle him. The train lights flashed far down the tunnel, but she could not move. When the song ended, the platform fell silent, except for the distant rumble. Emily wiped her eyes and spoke so softly she wasn't sure he heard it first. That is, the song my patient sang before he passed. The musician turned his head toward her voice. A small smile touched his face, the kind that comes when someone recognizes an old friend in a crowd. He asked, was his name Daniel? Emily's breath caught. She managed to nod, then remembered he could not see it. Yes, she said. Daniel Carter. How did you know? The blind musician rested his hand on the guitar strings to quiet them. He said, Daniel was my little brother. Emily felt the subway floor tilt beneath her. 23 years ago, when I was 17 and he was 19, a car accident took my sight and left him with guilt he never shook. He used to say the crash happened because he talked me into going to that concert. After the hospital released me, Daniel promised he would take care of me for life. But life, as we both learned, does not always keep promises. He told me he had found work upstate, that he would send money every month, that one day he would come back and we would live together again. The money came for a while. Then the letters grew shorter. Then they stopped. I never blamed him. I knew shame can make a man run farther than any road. All these years I have played the hymn our mother taught us, hoping somehow the notes would reach him and tell him I was still waiting, still loving him, still proud to call him brother. Emily's tears fell without sound. She said, Daniel never stopped talking about you. Even when the medicine made his thoughts wander, he would smile and say, my brother David sings better than the angels. He kept your picture beside his bed until the very end. On the night he left us, he asked me to promise I would find you one day and tell you he was sorry, and that he heard you singing every single night in his dreams. David lifted his face toward the ceiling, as if the sound of his brother's name might drift down like warm rain. He whispered, he heard me. Emily reached into her pocket and drew out a small silver cross on a worn chain. She pressed it into David's hand. Daniel wore this every day, she said. He wanted you to have it when we found you. I just never imagined we would be found by a song. The train rushed in, brakes sighing, doors sliding open. A handful of passengers stepped out and hurried away, unaware that two strangers stood holding 23 years of separation in their trembling hands. David closed his fingers around the cross and began to weep the way only men who have waited a lifetime can weep, quietly, deeply, without shame. Emily placed her arm gently around his shoulders. The train pulled away, leaving them in a pocket of stillness. Emily guided David to the bench against the tiled wall. They sat side by side while the next train came and went. Unseen and unheard, she told him everything she remembered about Daniel's last months. How he laughed at old jokes, even when breathing hurt. How he asked the nurses to open the window so he could hear city sounds and pretend he was still walking the streets with his brother. How he kept a tiny notebook where he wrote letters he never mailed. Emily had carried that notebook in her pocket for weeks after the funeral, waiting for the right moment, the right person. Now the moment had arrived on its own. David listened without interrupting, his thumb tracing the edges of the silver cross. When Emily finished, he asked softly, "May I read the letters?" She placed the worn notebook in his hands. David opened it carefully, running his fingers across the raised lines of braille that Daniel had secretly learned in his final year. Every page was written in both ink and dots, so that one day his blind brother could read the words himself. The first line brought David to his knees right there on the subway floor. "David, if you ever see this, know I never stopped being proud of you. I ran because I was ashamed, not because I stopped loving you. Every night, I fell asleep to the memory of you singing Mom's hymn. Keep singing, Big Brother. I will be listening from somewhere better." David's shoulders shook as he read aloud, his voice breaking and mending with every sentence. Passersby glanced, then looked away, giving them the small mercy of privacy in a public place. Emily rested her hand on his back and felt the years falling away from him like old coats too heavy to keep wearing. When he reached the last page, Daniel had written only 4 words. "Forgive me. Come home." David pressed the notebook to his heart. He whispered, "There is no one left to forgive you. Daniel, you were always home to me." Emily helped him stand. She said, "I live 3 stops from here. My shift ended an hour ago, and my couch is comfortable. Tonight, you sleep under a real roof, and tomorrow, we figure out the rest together." David started to protest, but she added gently, "Daniel asked me to take care of you the way you always took care of him. Please let me keep that promise." They walked arm in arm to the train that would carry them above ground. As the doors closed, David began to hum the hymn again. Softer this time, the way you hum when the storm has finally passed. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder and felt something loosen inside her chest, something that had been tight since the night Daniel drew his last breath. 2 strangers had become family in the space of 1 song. The next morning came gently through Emily's small living room curtains. David woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet clink of dishes. He sat up on the couch, blanket folded at his feet, and listened to Emily moving around the kitchen. She had left Daniel's notebook and the silver cross on the coffee table, right where his fingers could find them first thing. He touched them both, then called out softly, "You didn't have to do all this." Emily answered from the doorway, "I didn't do it for you. I did it for the man who kept asking me to find his brother before he could let go." They ate breakfast slowly, toast and eggs, nothing fancy. But the silence between them was easy, the kind that grows when 2 people have already shared the hardest parts. Emily told him about the hospice garden where Daniel's ashes were scattered under a young dogwood tree. She said the leaves turned the exact red of the flannel shirt Daniel wore in the photograph beside his bed. David smiled at that, the first full smile Emily had seen from him. He said, "Daniel always loved autumn." He said it felt like the world was singing goodbye in color. After breakfast, Emily took the day off. She borrowed her neighbor's car and drove David to the cemetery 2 towns over where their parents rested. The grass was still damp from morning dew when they found the stone marked with their family name. David knelt and ran his fingers across the engraved letters he had never seen but knew by heart. He spoke aloud, "Mom, Dad, I brought Daniel home. He's safe now. He is a prohuth of me." Emily stood a few steps back, giving him the space a man needs when he finally lays 23 years of guilt in the ground. When they reached the hospice garden later that afternoon, the dogwood was indeed blazing red, a small plaque at its base read in memory of Daniel Carter, beloved brother and friend. David traced the words with trembling fingers. He reached into his coat and drew out his guitar. Right there between the roses and the quiet benches, he began to play the hymn again. Stronger this time, the way it was meant to be sung when sorrow has turned into gratitude. A few patients in wheelchairs were rolled out to the patio to listen. One old woman closed her eyes and mouthed the words she still remembered from childhood. Emily stood beside David, tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were the light kind, the kind that come after rain. Weeks slipped by like quiet pages turning. David stayed with Emily at first, then moved into the spare room of the hospice itself, when they offered him a corner and a purpose. He came every afternoon to play for the patients who had no visitors, the ones whose names barely made it onto the charts. Some days he sang old hymns. Some days soft country tunes Daniel used to love. Some days just gentle chords that let people remember whatever they needed to remember. The nurses began calling him the subway angel, though he laughed and said angels don't ride the F train with a beat-up guitar. Emily watched the change in him the way you watch spring arrive, one shy leaf at a time. His shoulders no longer carried the weight of a brother. Lost, they carried the lighter, truer weight of a brother found. He still wore Daniel's silver cross outside his shirt now, catching the light whenever he moved. Patients reached for it sometimes, just to touch something that had traveled through so much sorrow and come out shining. David never refused. He would place their hands over the metal and say, "My little brother kept it warm for you." One December evening, the hospice threw its small Christmas party in the common room. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling, and the tree leaned a little to the left, the way tired things do. David played carols, while residents clapped, offbeat, and nurses wiped tears between smiles. Emily stood near the doorway watching him, and she realized she could no longer remember the exact moment her heart had quietly decided he belonged in her days forever. It had happened the same way grief leaves. Not all at once, but in slow, gentle pieces. When the last song ended, a teenage boy in a wheelchair rolled up to David. He was 16, thin from treatments, eyes too old for his face. He asked, "Can you teach me that hymn you always play? I want my mom to hear it when I get to wherever she is." David knelt, so their eyes were level. He said, "Your mom already knows it, but I'll teach you anyway, so you can sing harmony with her when you meet again." The boy smiled the way children do when someone finally tells them the truth, wrapped in kindness. Later that night, Emily and David walked home through the first snow. The city was hushed, every sound wrapped in white. He took her hand, the way you take something you have been afraid to reach for. She let him. Neither of them spoke until they reached her doorstep. Then David said, "Daniel used to tell me, love arrives when you stop looking for it and start giving it away." I think he was right. Emily answered by stepping close and resting her forehead against his. The snow kept falling, soft as forgiveness. Spring arrived early that year, the way it sometimes does when hearts have decided to heal. The dogwood in the hospice garden burst into pale pink before anyone expected, and David stood beneath it every morning, guitar slung over his shoulder, playing the hymn that had once carried only sorrow and now carried only gratitude. Patients asked him to record it for them. So Emily bought a simple microphone and they set it up in the sunroom. Within weeks, the recording had been played in rooms across 3 states, slipped into headphones of people breathing their last, whispered along with by children who had never heard it before but somehow already knew the tune. Someone uploaded it quietly to the internet with the title Daniel's Song, and strangers began writing that they fell asleep to it when nightmares came, or played it at funerals when words failed. David never took a penny. He said the song already belonged to everyone it needed to reach. Instead, he and Emily started a little fund with whatever donations arrived. Money for bus tickets so families could sit beside dying loved ones, warm blankets for those who felt cold long before winter guitars for teenagers stuck in hospital beds who wanted something to hold that wasn't a needle. They named it the Daniel Carter Fund, and every check was signed with the same line: "Keep singing, no matter what." One Saturday in May, David asked Emily to ride the subway with him, back to the same platform where everything had changed. The tiles were cleaner now, the lights a little brighter, but the corner still felt sacred. He tuned his guitar while the trains roared by, then began to play. Not the hymn this time, but a new melody, slow and hopeful, with words he had written on quiet nights when sleep refused him. Emily stood beside him, singing harmony, her voice soft but sure. People stop the way people sometimes do when they stumble upon something wholly disguised as ordinary. Phones came out, not to record for likes, but to capture something they knew they would need later, on a darker day. When the song ended, A young man in army fatigues stepped forward. He was on leave, heading home to a father he hadn't spoken to in years. He pressed a folded bill into David's hand and said, "Play that again at my dad's house tomorrow, if you can." I think it might say, "What I can't." David never opened the bill. He simply tucked it into the fund envelope and promised they would be there. That night, Emily and David sat on her couch, legs tangled under the same blanket that had once covered only a grieving stranger. He rested his head against hers and said, "I used to think losing my sight was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Turns out it was the door God used to walk me straight to my brother, and then straight to you." Emily kissed the place where the silver cross lay against his chest and answered, "Some doors only open when we stop trying to see our way through them." Summer settled warm and slow over the city. David and Emily married quietly in the hospice garden on a Sunday when the dogwood had already dropped its pink petals and the grass smelled like childhood. Only 20 people came, nurses who had become family, patients strong enough to sit in wheelchairs under the shade, the teenage boy who could now play the hymn almost as cleanly as David taught him. Emily wore a simple white dress she found in a second-hand shop, and David wore the same dark shirt he had worn the night they met. The silver cross hung outside his collar, catching sunlight the way promises do when they finally come true. They spoke vows. They wrote themselves. David said, "I promise to keep singing for you on the days the music feels too heavy, and to let you sing for me when my voice grows tired." Emily said, "I promise to walk the roads I can see so you never have to walk alone, and to trust the roads you hear when my eyes are not enough." The teenage boy played the hymn softly, while they slipped plain silver bands onto fingers that had waited a lifetime to hold someone without fear of letting go. When the last note faded, an old woman in the back row whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's how heaven sounds when it sneaks down here for a visit." They spent their honeymoon doing exactly what they had been doing all along, riding the subway lines, stopping at platforms where someone looked like they needed a song more than directions. Sometimes they played in hospital corridors at 3 in the morning when a night nurse texted that a patient was scared to fall asleep. Sometimes they sat on park benches while children danced clumsy circles around them. Wherever they went, the guitar case stayed open, not for money, but for notes people wanted to leave behind. Thank you, letters, prayer, requests, photographs of faces who had already gone ahead and were waiting on the other side of the music. Years began to pass the way subway cars do, some loud and hurried, some gentle and half-empty, all carrying them forward together. The Daniel Carter Fund grew until it could pay for a small house with a garden just big, enough for tomatoes and a wooden bench beneath another dogwood tree. They've planted it the day they moved in, pressing a little of Daniel's ashes into the soil so his brother would always have shade when the afternoons grew long. Every spring, the blossoms came back, pink and perfect, and every autumn, the leaves turned the exact red of the flannel shirt in the photograph they now kept on the mantel. David never regained his sight, and Emily never asked him to. Instead, they built a life measured in songs instead of scenery, in footsteps they could follow by heart, in the quiet certainty that some miracles arrive where in darkness so love can learn to see better. One October evening, 10 years after the subway night, Emily came home later than usual. She found David on the porch swing, guitar resting across his lap, fingers still against the strings. The air smelled of wood smoke and the first fallen leaves. She sat beside him without speaking at first, the way married people learn to do when words need time to arrive. Finally, she took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. David's breath caught. He whispered, "Are we?" Emily answered by guiding his fingers in a small circle, the way mothers do before there is anything to see. David laid the guitar aside and rested his forehead against hers, while the swing creaked beneath them like an old hymn. Remembering the tune, they named the baby Daniel. If it was a boy, Grace if it was a girl. Either way, the child would grow up, knowing the story of an uncle who ran away and came home in a song. The hospice patient sent tiny knitted blankets, each one a different color of hope. The teenage boy, now a tall young man studying music therapy, came every weekend to tune the old guitar and add new strings so the baby would never hear a sour note. David spent evenings composing a lullaby made of the softest parts of every hymn he knew, humming it against Emily's growing belly while fireflies blinked on and off like quiet On a cold February morning, Grace Daniel Carter was born with a cry that sounded exactly like the first note of the hymn that had started everything. David held her first, the way fathers do when they understand how fragile miracles are. He placed the silver cross around her tiny neck for just a moment, then returned it to his own, promising silently that she would have her own one day, carried through her own storms. Emily watched them together and felt the circle complete. A brother lost, a brother found, a stranger loved, a family born all inside one gentle melody. Years kept turning. Grace grew tall and kind, with Ermutter's steady eyes and her father Essier for every sorrow hidden in a voice. She learned to play the guitar before she could spell her whole name, sitting on David's knee while he guided her fingers to chords that held entire lifetimes. On Sundays, they went as a family to the hospice garden, now larger, with a small stage built from donations. Grace would sing harmony while David played, and Emily passed out coffee to whoever needed warmth more than words. People came from miles away just to sit under the dogwood and remember that kindness is not a feeling. It is a song you keep singing long after the pain has gone quiet. One night, when Grace was 15, she asked her father why he never wrote a sad song. David thought for a long time, rocking on the same porch swing that had once held their beginning. Then he answered, "Because every sad thing that ever happened to us turned into the reason you are here. How could I write it sad when the ending keeps getting happier?" The years softened like candle wax, slow and golden. David's hair turned the color of winter subway tiles, and Emily's laughter lines deepened into the map of every tear that had finally been allowed to dry. Grace grew into a young woman who could silence a crowded room with 3 quiet chords, and a voice that carried her uncle's gentleness and her mother's strength. She began traveling to children's hospitals and veterans' homes, taking the old guitar that had started everything, singing the songs her father taught her, and the new ones she wrote when someone needed a melody they had never heard before but somehow already knew. One spring afternoon, when the dogwood was heavy with blossom, Grace came home from college with a letter in her hand. She found her parents on the porch the way she always found them, David's hand resting on Emily's knee, Emily's head against his shoulder, the swing moving just enough to keep time with whatever hymn lived in their hearts that day. Grace sat on the step below them and read the letter aloud. It was from a man in Ohio who had heard Daniel's song on the night his wife died. He wrote that the melody had held him together long enough to raise their daughter alone. And now that daughter was getting married and wanted Grace to sing at the wedding the same song that had carried her father through the darkest year of his life. David listened with his eyes closed, the way he listened to everything important. When Grace finished reading, he smiled and said, "Go, take the guitar. Tell them Daniel is still keeping promises." Emily added, "And take your mother, because some circles need closing in person." So the 3 of them drove across 3 states, following highways Daniel had once traveled, running away, now traveling back toward him in gratitude. The wedding was small, held in a country church with windows open to let May in. Grace sang while the bride walked down the aisle to her father's arm, both of them crying for the woman who should have been there but somehow was. When the last note faded, the father of the bride came forward and placed something in David's hand. A silver cross on a new chain, bought that morning. He said, she would want the circle to keep growing. David closed his fingers around it and felt the years fold gently into one quiet, perfect moment. That night, back home under their own dogwood, the 3 of them sat on the porch long after midnight. Grace rested her head on her father's shoulder, the way Emily once had. Fireflies rose and fell like small lanterns, carried by invisible hands. David began to play the hymn one more time, softer than ever, the way you play when you know the song has done its work and can finally rest. Emily and Grace sang harmony without thinking. 3 voices braided so closely they sounded like one. Somewhere above them, or perhaps inside them, Daniel listened and smiled the way older brothers do when the little ones finally understand the joke was always love. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change someone's world. Share this story if it touched your heart.